Hey, that's me. So I'm Paul Kirtley. Some of you I know me very well. Some of you know me a little bit. Some of you maybe don't know me from Batman. I write a blog. It's become very popular. If you type Bushcraft blog into Google, it's the one that comes up top. We won some awards, apparently. Oh, I used to work with that guy. I used to work with Lars as well. Great guy to work with. And also spent a bit of time working with Gordon Hillman, just a little bit, but I learnt a lot from him in that time. And I've also been lucky enough to travel a bit and learn some bushcraft firsthand from various indigenous peoples. Some of that will come into my talk today. And also, that's the kind of holiday I like to go on. I like to get out there into wild places. And as I said the other day when I got the awards, it feels a little bit strange standing in the middle of a field near to Derby, talking about bushcraft and doing bushcraft, because for me, a lot of it is about taking the skills and using them. But it's fantastic to see so many people enthusiastic and getting together and interested in the skills, and it's a pleasure to be able to stand here and talk to you today. The title of my talk, The Difference Between Foraging and Living Off the Land, and it's meant to be slightly controversial and also just make you think about the definitions. Foraging has become very popular. TV shows, people like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall touch on it, lots of other hedgerow type things, right through to sort of roadkill chef. Lots of people are interested in free food, wild food, foraging, and even restaurants now, lots of wild foods appearing, whether it's pub menus right through to posh restaurants in London. Hicks, for example, you've probably never heard of it, but there's a restaurant in London. He sources a lot of wild foods. It's become a fashionable thing. But because of that, to me, it's my perception, foraging has become a slightly more narrow definition. For a lot of people, it seems to be going and picking things from the hedgerow and maybe taking them home, putting them in a salad, and finding a few berries and what have you. You look at the definition of foraging, even on Wikipedia, and you look at foraging in terms of, say, bears. It's about all of the food that they get. It's not just about picking a few greens out the hedgerow and scrubbing a few roots. It's about all of the food and collecting the food. And that's why I just wanted to talk about these different definitions and also give you a few insights and also leave you with some questions to think about in terms of what these things mean and what it means to actually live off the land. We're all interested in bushcraft, we're all interested in foraging, obviously you're here, but what does it mean to actually live off the land? So first off, let's have a little quiz. Some hedgerow greens. What's this? Garlic. Wild garlic, ramsons. Yeah. That one? Wood sorrel. Yeah, fantastic. Next one, Henry. Some violets in there. Okay. Yeah, all tasty greens. Great stitchwort. Anybody know that one? Common sorrel. Chickweed. Red shanks, brooklime, that one. Sorry? Yeah, it is, ribwort plantain. Yeah. So there's lots of stuff out there that a lot of us recognise and we can go out and we can pick it, but most of it's sort of salad stuff. And if you were to come on a bushcraft course with me and you'd done a hard morning of bow drilling and I gave you a plate full of that stuff, you probably wouldn't be very impressed. You think, well, where's the energy? It's not going to keep me going for very long. And that's the kind of incongruity that I see, is that a lot of foraging teaching goes towards picking all the green stuff, and yet what we actually need is something else in terms of keeping us going and actually being able to live. Obviously we can go for fruits, there's more energy in there, there's berries and there's nuts, but they're quite seasonal, a lot of them. So we need to know a range of foods, but also some of them are not available all the year round. Some of these things are very, very tight windows of opportunity for you to collect them. And obviously we can then start looking at preserving things, but that's then another step on beyond just picking things, living off the land as we go. Here's another one as a test. So we've looked at lots of British stuff so far. Anybody know what that is? No? No. That's bunchberry, so that's one you see quite a lot in Canada, in Ontario, where we do canoe trips, and it's edible. Yeah, but it's, again, you need to know the specifics of the environment to know what you can eat. You know, there's a lot there that I've shown you that we're familiar with, but then once you get out of that zone, there's a whole range of other things that we're not familiar with, and so you need that local knowledge as well. So we need energy. Yeah, if I gave you a plate full of greens, if I fed you on that for a week, you'd get pretty hungry. You know, some wood sorrel, bit of stitchwort, a few violet leaves, you're going to get pretty hungry and pretty ratty pretty quickly. So we need energy, and these days, where do we get our energy from? Well, pasta, wheat-based products, bread, again, potatoes, rice. That's where we get most of our carbohydrates from these days. But none of it is native to where we live here. Some of it is native in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, some of it's native in North America, some of it's native in Asia, and some of it's cultivated and has been cultivated for a long time. So in terms of us actually living off the land here and now, we're not going to find any of that stuff. And also, if we think about our ancestors, they also would have had a hard time finding anything like that. There might have been some grasses that are similar to wheat, but it's not potatoes and it's not pasta. So a lot of where we get our energy from and we take for granted is not available to us if we're just out foraging, trying to live off the land. We also need protein, and obviously we can get protein from nuts. If we're talking about plant foods, and some foods like nettles, they're quite high in protein for a green plant, about 8% by dry weight. We can get proteins from plant foods, but we really do need, apart from some very specific environments, we need to start looking at meat and fish. Small game is obviously easier to catch, so things like squirrel and rabbits and what have you, but grey squirrels are not native here, other squirrels are. Rabbits are not native here, introduced. But even where there is small game, such as rabbits and squirrels, it's all lean meat. Yeah. Has anybody ever heard of rabbit starvation? Yeah, you've probably heard of it if you're reading about trappers, particularly in the north. Our body can only do so much in terms of translating, converting protein into energy. It's limited by what our liver can do, and that in turn is limited by the blood supply to the liver. So if we're catching squirrels and rabbits, which are all pretty lean, we could have a full belly. We could eat, 10 rabbits a day, be absolutely stuffed, but there's only a certain amount that our body can do to process that protein into the energy that we need. And it translates to about 400 grams of carbohydrate, which, if you know the calorie value of carbohydrate, is about 1,600 calories. It's about 4 calories per gram. So you can only, maximum from lean meat, get about 1,600 calories per day, however much you eat. And that's why those trappers who were spending a lot of time and energy, particularly out in the cold, maybe expending 5,000-6,000 calories a day, they're only getting a limited amount back as a result of that. So they had full bellies, but they were losing weight and they were starving because they couldn't convert the protein into energy. So we can look at larger animals, and here's this is off a fallow deer. We've got kidneys and heart, and also the liver's very good. And that's the sort of stuff you want to eat first. It might seem a bit gruesome, but you can take that and eat it first. And the liver's good because the liver is one of the places in our body that we store carbohydrate. Glycogen is stored in our liver, and we can access that from other animals' livers. So that's why it's one of the hunter's meats, and also it goes off quite quickly. So you want to eat the liver fairly soon, and you take the heart and the kidneys and the liver, fry them up, cook them over the fire, whatever. That's a good source of protein and energy to start off with. But even so, we want to be able to preserve that energy perhaps, or maybe we want to add to it. So, does anybody know what that berry is? No, sorry? It's like a rose, it looks like a rose head, doesn't it? But that's Saskatoon berry. That's the common name for it. And that was one of the things that native North Americans used to make pemmican. So they added dried, pounded meat with fat and fruit. And they used other fruits as well, but Saskatoon berry was one of the ones that they used. And that then allowed that food to be preserved, and it also was a highly calorific food that they could store and use over the winter, and avoided that issue of taking lean meat from small game and not having the calories that they needed. Also fish. Yeah, fish, we often think about fish as not being a very reliable or viable source because we look at it from the perspective of modern angling. I've been fly fishing and it's extremely pleasurable to spend the day on the bank, maybe have a beer as well. You know, you might catch a salmon or a trout or something depending on where you are, but you don't tend to catch a huge number of fish. It's a fairly labour-intensive pastime for the result that you get at the end of it. Now, all of these fish were caught with a net, yeah? And that's not sporting, but it's catching and it's killing. So if you look at indigenous people who relied upon fish, a lot of the time they were using nets, and they were very good at making cordage and very good at making nets. And these were all caught. This was in Ontario, up on a native reserve, and there's pike in there. There's wide-mouthed bass. There's suckerfish, and there's some walleye in there as well. There's lots of good stuff in there, and that's all just with a net out overnight. And it's a passive technique. You can go off and do something else while the net's doing the work for you, and that's Norm. Those of you that were here for Ray's talk the other night, heard he mentioned Norm Duckies. That's Norm, again, just looking at how to prepare some of those things and taking the different parts of the fish and using them for different things. Some for smoking, for preserving, some for eating straight away, and other bits, you know, the roe off some of them. Lots of valuable food resource there. In terms of finding out how we might live off the land, we need to look at a couple of things. One is, are we talking about survival situation? Are we looking at surviving a few days? Are we looking at surviving a few weeks? And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you can get by on a very limited calorie diet as long as you're eating the right things. If you're eating about 500 calories of carbohydrate a day, that will keep your system going, it will keep your stomach enzymes working, and then when you do get food, when you do get meat, you can get that fat on board, you can get the protein on board. Whereas if you eat nothing, there's this myth that you can go for 3 weeks without food. Yes, you can, but you have to be rescued in week 4 and you have to be put on a drip in a hospital because your stomach doesn't work properly. If you catch some food in week 4 and you've not eaten anything for 3 weeks, you're going to have a hard time digesting it. So you need to keep eating stuff, and that's where the plant foods, sort of the small stuff that you can collect, get a few carbs in, a few berries, a few tuberous roots, and we'll look at those. You can get that into your system, and then as and when you catch a fish or catch a rabbit or a squirrel or something, you can take that on board. Also, we can look at how indigenous people that still live off the land, how they live off the land. What do they do to survive? Because they're surviving for longer, and that's part of the question. Is it a short-term survival situation, or is it actually living off the land and maintaining, growing stronger, maintaining your body and staying healthy and fit? And that's an entirely different question. It's removed again, once removed again, from just collecting a few greens to put in your salad on a Sunday afternoon. Survival situation, you can have a bit of plant knowledge and get by, and a bit of trapping and fishing, but then when it actually comes to living off the land for your life, your entire life, we can look at people who do that, and we can also look at history, and we can look at archaeology. Now, I've been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with the Hadza in Tanzania. One of the first things you notice about hunter-gatherers, in my experience, is that they're entirely opportunistic. They will eat just about anything that they can get their hands on. This guy, they've just shot a baboon with bows and arrows. They've got 2. It might seem a bit brutal, and I apologise for some of the pictures that are coming up, but it just shows you the reality of the life that these people have. There is very much a romantic idea about just going off and living off the land. It's extremely difficult. You need detailed knowledge of an environment, whatever that environment is, and you need to be skilled. You can't just wander in. Even in a relatively uncomplicated material society like the Hadza, they're not as complex in their hunting or their equipment as, say, the Inuit. But even there, they still have basic equipment. They have bows and arrows, they have fire sticks, they have a knife, they have a cooking pot, which they've traded more latterly, but they have some basic equipment that they can use to live off the land. If you land as a survivor in a situation, not only do you not know the environment, you don't have those tools at your disposal, maybe you don't even have the skills to make them. So even in a relatively simple material culture like the Hadza, they still have great skill and they have the tools that they need to do the job. So these guys just killed baboons to get a fire going. They get the baboons on the fire, like you would with a pig, burn the hairs off, and then they take them off the fire and butcher them. There's a close up. It looks a bit gruesome, doesn't it? So there they put leaves down on the ground to keep the meat dirt free. Then they're butchering it up into sections, some of it to eat straight away, some of it to take home. There's all the different bits of meat on the embers cooking, and they don't cook it for very long. I tried various different bits, and it was, what they're doing is just making sure there's no bacteria on the outside really, and just softening up the meat as much as possible, and then consuming it. And they eat everything. I watched with interest as a guy prized open the top of this baboon's head and ate the brain. They don't waste anything. There's some meat to take home, and they often save some of the best bits to take home for the family, for the wives and the kids. And that was breakfast, by the way. This was sort of 9 o'clock in the morning that this was going on. Baboon for breakfast. Okay. But as I say, they're opportunistic, and they did eat the liver, as I said, and I tried some too, and it's very good. It's very tasty. They take advantage of the energy that's there, the nutrients that are there. But on the way back, they spot some bush babies up in the acacias, and away they go again. But even though they've got full stomachs, they're opportunistic. Yeah, we're going to get those. So away they go, and eventually it was a young lad who got it, headshot. He was very happy with that. He was a very good hunter, that lad. He was very good. He was only about 12 or 13, and he was an exceptionally good shot. This is one of their camps. Very, very simple, just simple wiki-ups. You can see where they've had fires, and if you look closely around the camp, you also start spotting things like this, grinding stones, where they've been grinding up nuts and seeds to get the energy from those, the oils and the carbohydrate content. So they're not just hunting, and this is one of the things, people characterise our ancestors in the Paleolithic, so before we start to move towards farming, as hunters, because largely that's what the archaeological evidence says, that you find mammoth kill sites or mammoth butchery sites with butchery marks in the bones, and there is archaeological evidence of us eating meat and animals, and so therefore we're characterised, sort of our European ancestors, as being meat eaters, as being hunters. But there's less evidence of plant foods being used, and less evidence of other maybe small game we might have eaten. So there's a very patchy list of evidence, and so archaeologists have to work with what they've got. But when you start looking at people who live off the land today, you see that they eat a very, very broad range of foods. Here, some of the Hadzabe women digging for roots, digging for tubers, and they spot a vine growing in amongst the shrubs. And you can see bottom left of the picture there's some tubers that they've collected. And that's their sort of fallback food. And they're packed with starch, they're packed with complex carbohydrate, and even if the men come home empty-handed from their hunt, there is carbohydrate there that they need for energy. Remember, we talked about us needing that energy, and me giving you a plate full of leaves, you wouldn't be very impressed. We need something, we all go and get a baked potato or something for lunch perhaps. That's the stuff we naturally head towards, and it's cooked. There's this, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody here, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you can't live off raw food. There's this fad for raw foodism, and most people who are raw foodists are very thin, they're very weak, they look malnourished, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you need to cook your food. And there's a very interesting book by a guy called Richard Wrangham, who has this hypothesis that one of the reasons we've got such a big brain is that we've cooked our food for a very long time. That allows us to have a smaller digestive system. That means that we've got more energy available for our brain, and that's why we've moved on in terms of the capacity of our brain compared to some of our hominid ancestors. So it's interesting to note that when you look at indigenous people and they're getting these complex carbohydrate rich foods, they're cooking them. They're not eating them raw, they're cooking them so that you can get more energy out of them. It's the same with us. We cook our baked potatoes. You also can look at other cultures. There's loads of burdock all over the country here. In Asia, it's valued as a food. It's a tasty thing that you'll get in Japan, in Korea, and places, and they cut it up and they fry it up with sesame seeds and various other things. Nice. If you ever get any burdock roots, slice them up into little batons, stir fry them with a bit of sesame oil, a bit of soy sauce on. Very, very tasty. It's all around the countryside, but it requires you to dig it up, and it can be a bit of effort. That's the rosette of leaves. That's the flower. It's in the thistle family, and you can see that from the flower very clearly. There's some of the guys in one of my courses digging it up. Requires a digging stick, very similar to what the Hadza women are doing, digging up the roots, and there's one of the roots. Some of them can be a bit woody, but they are tasty once cooked. So as I said, we can look at history and archaeology as well. So history, we can look at written history, we can look at more recent history. What did people eat? So times of potato famine, potato blight. Some native foods here that people went back to, silverweed. Yeah, again, it's in the rose family, it's very common. It's a small root. They've got small underground storage organs with starch, but they're easy to collect and there's lots of them. And what you'll notice is that in terms of collecting starch, you either go for big things that might be a bit difficult to dig up but are worth the effort, or small things that are numerous, close together and easy to collect. And silverweed is one of them. Another one, pignut. Those are the leaves. It's in the carrot family, looks similar to parsley perhaps, if you recognise the leaves. And there's one of the pignuts, not a huge one, with the outer skin taken off. And very tasty. You can eat it raw, but again, you get more nutrition from it if you cook it. But a good source of carbohydrate. And those diminutive roots might seem, well, are they worth collecting? But people lived off those, yeah, both in Scotland and in Ireland during times of potato blight. People lived off silverweed and pignut. Here we have a few other small underground storage organs, and you do need to be careful. These are all growing pretty much in the same square inch or cubic inch of soil. You've got pignut on the left, you've got celandine in the middle, and you've got bluebell on the right. Now bluebells are poisonous. Celandines, you can eat the roots if you cook them, but there's toxins. They're in the buttercup family. There's toxins in all of the buttercups. And then you've got pignut, which is edible raw or cooked. So you do need to make sure that you recognise the right one. Another one that's very interesting, both from a short-term survival perspective, but also a longer-term survival perspective, is cattail. Now this is a very common plant around the Northern Hemisphere. You find it in wet places, on the edges of ponds. Gardeners with ponds probably find it a bit of a pain sometimes, because it does tend to take over whole areas. It spreads both by the seeds, you can see the brown seed heads there, cigar-shaped seed heads, but also ropey rhizomes which go out under the water, and then you get new shoots coming up. And the energy for those new shoots coming up, you get starch-surrounded fibres in the rhizomes, and that starch is very, very good. Now, if you're in a survival situation, this is one of the best foods to look for. You can find them easily, you can identify them easily, make sure that you pull up the whole plant, because there can be other things growing nearby like iris, hemlock water dropwort, that you don't want to be eating. So don't just look at the aerial parts of the plant, reach down and pull up the first root you find, because there can be other stuff there, particularly in winter. The aerial parts of this plant will often be present in winter, whereas those other things like iris and particularly hemlock water dropwort will have died back. And people have died by thinking they were collecting the roots of this plant. They've collected hemlock water dropwort roots, and in one case there was a survival course somewhere in Eastern Europe, and 8 students and the instructor died because they ate the wrong thing. So always bring out the aerial part attached to the root, and then you've got a positive identification of both parts. So from a survival perspective, take the ropey rhizomes, put them on the fire, cook them until they're black on the embers, and then open them out, suck the starch off the fibres. All very good. Easy to process, easy to collect, instant energy. There's one of the students. Again, he's got the whole plant there. Aerial parts and the rhizomes on the bottom there, still connected. And here's an area, it's in Canada. That's in Ontario. And again, it's in a depression, there's water there, they're growing. Now there's evidence, there's a paper published in 2010, various sites around Europe and into Russia of basically grinding vessels that are being found with the starch of cattail in it. And the hypothesis is that they were grinding the roots up to release the starch to make flour. And the calorie content of flour is pretty much the same as a good quality wheat flour. And the date of these grinding stones in this process goes back 30,000 years. So if we look at the archaeological evidence now, there's some little snippets of evidence coming out to suggest that we were processing plant foods for complex carbohydrates long before we previously thought we were, and we were eating those things alongside those meats and those other foods that we've been characterised as eating almost predominantly by the other archaeological evidence in a similar way to indigenous peoples still living off the land today. So all the answers about how to live off the land are not in this presentation, but hopefully that gives you a few things to think about, a few insights into our relationship with living off the land in the past, how we might do it in the short term today, and how people that are still living off the land today manage to do it. Thank you for your attention. That was my presentation. It's meant to be thought-provoking. It's not supposed to provide all the answers, because all the answers aren't there. You know, a lot of people ask me, how would you live off the land in the northern temperate wilderness over the long term, like our ancestors did? Well, two things. One is we've changed the environment so much through forestry and farming. It's difficult to know exactly what it was like. We've gone through cycles of ice age and back again. I went to a very interesting presentation and display at the Natural History Museum, sorry, the British Museum recently, and it was on ice age art. And there was all these mammoth bones and reindeer antlers and various other artifacts inscribed with art, and some of them going back 18, 22, 25,000 years ago. And I've spent a lot of time in the north of Sweden, and up there you get ptarmigan, which are a type of grouse, you get wolverine, which are in the weasel family, like a badger but bigger. They'll kill a reindeer, and reindeer obviously up there as well. And there was art from southern Europe and the Pyrenees that had those animals on them from about 20,000 years ago. So once you start looking into it, it's very interesting. You know, we kind of characterise living in the past in the environment that we're in today. It was a very, very different environment at certain times in the past, in terms of the flora and the fauna that were available, and also in terms of what we've done to it since. So we can only grasp at looking through little keyholes, if you like, through the evidence that's there, but it's also very, very interesting. And thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'll probably take one or two. I've gone over by 5 minutes, but if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
You're talking about foraging in this country.
Yes.
How much damage is actually taking place? Because I've noticed bushcraft has become very, very popular.
Yep.
But then you've got your fringe elements, haven't you? The people with a little knowledge. Has there been any survey to find out how much damage is actually being done?
Are you talking about damage to the environment or damage to people's health?
Well, no, damage to, I'm not worried about the health, it's their choice if they want to eat it. But in terms of the environment.
I'm not aware of any surveys having been done, to be honest, but anecdotally, you know, there's definitely been an upsurge in people going out in an organised way to collect various things, particularly fungi, to take them to things like farmers markets and even places like Borough Market in London. And it's often people who know the fungi. So we don't have a great history of foraging for fungi in this country, you know, but the Eastern Europeans, they have, in some cases, a good knowledge. So I know of, you know, I work on various estates, and I know that some of them have problems with, say, Poles who know their fungi very well, coming and foraging, taking them away for economic reasons, which actually isn't legal, and without landowner's permission, and them ending up on the market, which over time, no doubt, will cause some damage because they're removing the fungi, they're not able to spore, and that's going to diminish the populations, I would have thought, over time. But I'm not aware of any surveys. Anybody else aware of any surveys?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Well, I mean, I did one.
All right, okay, good. You need to publicise it now.
One of the interesting things that came out of it was that, of course, there's an impact.
Yeah.
Foragers, I spent time with, are extremely conscious of their impact.
Yeah.
Whereas farmers
Yes.
and local councils were destroying wildlife.
Yeah, and this is one of the interesting things. I spend a bit of time in London, and you walk along the canal, one of the canals in London, and there's all sorts there. There's Alexanders, there's wild garlic, there's white dead nettle, there's different mustards, there's all sorts there. And then the British waterways just come along and strim it all,
Yeah, that's what was happening.
which is much more damaging than any foragers picking a few leaves. And yet you see these sort of old Romanian ladies wandering along at times picking stuff. It's not the British people, it's often, you know, the people who have got that knowledge from maybe when they were younger, living, you know, in a more rural, you know, life, and they're picking the things in town. And then you've got people who are brought into foraging who are picking those things, but in a small way, you know. That's my anecdotal view. Yeah, I think we've done much more damage. You're right, we've done much more damage with farming. Yeah.
Commercial foraging,
Yeah.
you know, they were being so careful, and then the next day we go back to a patch of dried past us.
Yeah.
I was just there for research purposes, and the council stripped the whole lot. They
Yes.
exactly what it said.
Yeah.
And you kind of think, oh,
Yeah.
there's a lot of food there.
Yeah, people don't appreciate it as a resource. Yeah. Any other questions? Good. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Cheers.